JonBenet Ramsey became a global mystery before she could ever grow up, and decades later, when her family finally broke their silence, the revelation sent shockwaves through a world that thought it already knew the truth. For years, the name JonBenet Ramsey existed in a strange space between memory and myth. The case never truly faded. It simply settled into the background of public consciousness, resurfacing whenever a documentary aired or a headline hinted at new interest. In this fictional retelling, the silence surrounding her family became as famous as the crime itself. Decades passed, yet that quiet remained unbroken, heavy with speculation and unanswered questions. The world learned to live with a mystery, even as it quietly refused to let go. Time moved forward, but the past stayed perfectly preserved. Old footage continued to circulate, showing a smiling child frozen in moments of joy, contrasted against grim headlines that followed her death. The family retreated further from public view, becoming figures defined less by who they were and more by what the world believed they knew. In this story, the silence was not emptiness. It was a presence, shaping opinions and fueling theories without ever confirming or denying them. As years turned into decades, something subtle began to shift. Researchers quietly revisited archived material. Long-forgotten documents were requested again. Private records, once sealed away by time and grief, were re-examined through a modern lens. Nothing dramatic announced itself. There were no leaks, no sudden statements, only small movements that suggested the past was being disturbed. Observers noticed legal filings reappearing in public databases. Analysts pointed out renewed activity tied to the case, enough to stir curiosity, but not enough to explain it. The public reacted instinctively. Online discussions reignited, this time sharper, more intense than before. A new generation, raised on true crime content, approached the case without nostalgia, questioning old assumptions with fresh skepticism. To them, the long silence felt less like absence and more like tension stretched thin. Every detail from the past was pulled back into focus, examined with new tools and modern theories. In this fictional account, the family remained unseen, but their presence was felt more strongly than it had in years. The silence that once seemed protective now carried a different weight. Some interpreted it as restraint, others as fear of reopening wounds that never healed. The idea that those closest to JonBenet might finally speak unsettled the balance that had existed for so long. The mystery had survived because nothing definitive replaced it. Any disruption now threatened to reshape how the world understood the case. What made this moment so powerful was not certainty, but anticipation. The silence had become part of the story, and breaking it meant risking everything that had been built around it. The world did not know what would come next, only that something had begun to move after years of stillness. In the shadows of old evidence and unresolved questions, the first cracks appeared in a wall that had stood for decades, and the possibility of change felt both thrilling and deeply unsettling. As renewed attention spread, the past was pulled into the present with uncomfortable force. Old timelines were reconstructed piece by piece, not as they had been remembered, but as they could now be reanalyzed. In this fictional narrative, investigators and independent researchers began to notice inconsistencies that once seemed insignificant. Small gaps in the sequence of events, overlooked years earlier, suddenly stood out when viewed together. These were not dramatic revelations, but quiet misalignments that suggested the story might never have been as simple as it appeared. The family's public history was scrutinized again, this time with less emotion and more methodical precision. Archival interviews, statements, and appearances were reviewed without the assumptions that once framed them. What emerged was not a clear answer, but a pattern of carefully controlled exposure. Certain moments were repeated endlessly, while others were strangely absent. In this retelling, those absences became as important as what was visible, hinting at decisions made under pressure and fear rather than clarity. Media coverage also came under examination. Early reports were found to rely heavily on speculation, often amplified by competition, and urgency rather than verified facts. The rush to fill airtime had blurred lines between evidence and assumption. As a result, narratives formed quickly and hardened over time. In this fictional version of events, those early impressions shaped public belief so strongly that later corrections barely mattered. The truth, whatever it was, struggled to surface beneath layers of repetition and bias. Meanwhile, newly accessible technology changed how evidence was interpreted. Materials once considered inconclusive were processed again using advanced methods. The results did not deliver simple answers, but raised new questions that complicated the established narrative. Details thought to support one theory now appeared neutral or even contradictory. Instead of narrowing possibilities, the evidence seemed to widen them, suggesting that earlier conclusions may have been built on incomplete understanding. As attention grew, so did tension. Supporters of long-held theories pushed back against reevaluation, seeing it as an attempt to rewrite history. Others welcomed the uncertainty, believing doubt was necessary for truth to emerge. The case transformed into a battleground of interpretation, where every detail carried emotional weight. In this story, the renewed scrutiny did not bring closure. It exposed how fragile certainty had always been. Behind all of this, the family remained silent. Their absence from the conversation became increasingly noticeable, not because it was new, but because the world had changed around it. What once felt like distance now felt deliberate. The question was no longer just what happened, but why the silence had lasted so long, and what it might mean if it finally ended. As the investigation deepened in this fictional retelling, attention shifted away from timelines and technology and toward the emotional landscape surrounding the case. Years of silence were no longer viewed only as absence, but as a force that shaped perception. Analysts began to explore how grief, fear, and relentless public pressure might alter behavior over time. The family's withdrawal from the spotlight was re-examined not as a single choice, but as a long series of reactions to scrutiny that never truly faded. Public memory of the case had frozen the family in a specific moment, yet real lives continued beyond it. In this narrative, records showed how routines changed, friendships dissolved, and boundaries tightened. The family appeared to build a protective shell, limiting access to preserve what little normalcy remained. This isolation, while understandable, fueled suspicion in the public imagination. Silence became interpreted as concealment, even though it may have been rooted in survival rather than secrecy. Independent researchers focused on overlooked personal details rather than physical evidence. Old calendars, travel patterns, and lifestyle shifts were mapped out, revealing periods of abrupt change. These shifts did not point to guilt or innocence, but to disruption. The case had not simply taken a life. It had altered every relationship connected to it. In this telling, the tragedy expanded outward like ripples, affecting choices that later appeared unusual only because the context had been forgotten. The role of public opinion became central. Once a narrative took hold, it shaped how every action was interpreted. A statement meant to protect privacy could be seen as evasive. A refusal to engage could be framed as avoidance. Over time, perception hardened into belief. This chapter reveals how the family became trapped between two impossible options: speak and risk distortion, or remain silent and be judged for it. Neither path offered relief. As renewed interest grew, anonymous sources and secondary figures stepped forward, offering fragments of memory and interpretation. These accounts varied widely, often contradicting one another. Instead of clarity, they added layers of confusion. Each new claim promised revelation, but delivered uncertainty. The truth seemed increasingly buried beneath the weight of interpretation, speculation, and emotional investment from those far removed from the original events. By the end of this phase, the case no longer felt anchored to evidence alone. It had become a study of how tragedy evolves when left unresolved. Silence, once passive, now felt active, shaping the story as much as any fact. In this fictional account, Chapter 3 closes with a realization that the mystery endured not only because answers were missing, but because the space around those answers had grown too crowded for truth to stand clearly on its own. After years of avoiding attention, the family started allowing carefully controlled information to surface. Small actions carried heavy meaning. Archived documents were quietly released. Old statements were clarified. Legal barriers that once blocked discussion were lifted. None of this arrived all at once, but together they signaled a change that caught the public off guard. Observers noticed that the family no longer seemed focused on defending the past, but on reshaping the future of the case. Instead of reacting to accusations, they redirected attention toward unresolved questions and missing evidence. This shift altered the tone of public discussion. Long-held assumptions were challenged, not by emotion, but by documentation and timelines that had rarely been examined together. The case began to feel less like a frozen mystery and more like an active investigation again. Media response was intense. Some praised the move as overdue transparency, while others questioned the timing. In this narrative, analysts suggested that the decision to break silence was influenced by changes in public awareness. True crime culture had evolved. Audiences were more critical of early media coverage and more aware of how narratives can distort facts. The family appeared to recognize that the moment was finally right to speak without being completely consumed by suspicion. As new material circulated, attention turned toward earlier investigative decisions. Gaps that once seemed minor now appeared significant. Certain leads had been dismissed too quickly. Key evidence had been misinterpreted or overshadowed by sensational details. The focus slowly moved away from personal blame and toward institutional failure. This redirection unsettled those who had built careers around a single version of events. The emotional weight of this shift was impossible to ignore. Years of isolation, loss, and public judgment had shaped every step the family took. In this fictional retelling, their silence was reframed not as avoidance, but as endurance. Each year without answers had added pressure, and breaking that silence carried risk. Once the door opened, it could never fully be closed again. At the same time, renewed scrutiny brought fresh tension. Every document released raised new questions. Every clarification sparked debate. Instead of resolution, the case entered a new phase of uncertainty. The difference now was that the uncertainty felt shared. Responsibility no longer rested on one household alone, but on a system that had struggled to balance urgency, fairness, and truth. By the end of this chapter, the case stood at a crossroads. The silence that once defined it had been broken, but clarity remained out of reach. What changed most was perception. The story was no longer just about what happened long ago, but about how time, pressure, and public judgment can reshape reality. In this fictional account, Chapter 4 closes with the sense that the truth may not be hidden anymore, but uncover it would demand patience, restraint, and a willingness to question everything once believed to be certain. The case moved into a stage that felt both quieter and heavier than anything before it. There were no dramatic arrests or sudden revelations. Instead, there was a slow reckoning with what decades of uncertainty had done to everyone involved. Investigators, journalists, and the public were forced to confront the possibility that the most damaging element of the case was not a single action, but the passage of time itself. As renewed attention settled, the investigation was symbolically reopened under modern standards. Advances in forensic science offered hope, but also exposed how limited earlier tools had been. Evidence once thought exhausted was re-examined with new technology, producing fragments of information that were intriguing but incomplete. Each result hinted at answers, while stopping just short of confirmation. The truth seemed closer than ever, yet still out of reach. Public reaction shifted again. The shock that followed the family's decision to break their silence evolved into something more subdued. Online discussions became less accusatory and more reflective. Viewers revisiting the case began to notice how early assumptions had hardened into beliefs without being fully tested. In this fictional telling, the world started to understand how narratives, once established, can trap everyone inside them. The family's role in the story also changed in tone. They were no longer central figures in debate about guilt or innocence, but symbols of a tragedy that never found closure. Their continued presence in the public eye served as a reminder that unresolved cases do not fade. They linger, reshaping lives in quiet, relentless ways. Every anniversary reopened old wounds, not just for them, but for a public that had grown up alongside the mystery. The most unsettling realization came from what remained unanswered. Despite years of investigation, media coverage, and speculation, the core question still stood untouched. The lack of resolution forced a broader reflection on justice itself. In this narrative, the case became an example of how certainty can be an illusion, and how the need for answers can sometimes overshadow compassion and restraint. As attention slowly began to drift again, the legacy of the case solidified. It was no longer just a story about a single crime, but about the consequences of fear, pressure, and rushed conclusions. Future investigators would study it not only for what went wrong, but for how easily truth can be buried under noise. The chapter closes with an uneasy calm. There is no clear ending, only the acknowledgement that some stories resist closure. In this fictional account, the world is left changed not by a final answer, but by the understanding that silence, once broken, cannot restore what was lost. The case remains suspended between memory and mystery, a reminder that sometimes the most shocking truth is how long uncertainty can endure.